Sometimes the most forgotten souls find what the world needs most. When you've been cast aside by society, living with only your dog for company, you learn that loyalty runs deeper than blood and truth matters more than comfort. Mountain man Jed Carter knew this well. For years, folks in town saw him as nothing more than a hermit wandering the wilderness with his hound Boone. But when they stumbled upon an old stagecoach hidden deep in the woods, everything changed. Inside a rotted chest lay papers that could destroy the powerful men who controlled their county. These weren't just any documents. They were proof of 20 years of lies, stolen land, and broken promises. The same men who had dismissed Jed as worthless now faced their worst nightmare. What would you do if you held the power to bring justice to those who thought they were untouchable? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine needles like old memories, reluctant to let go, as the first pale light of dawn crept through the Montana wilderness. Jed Carter stood on the porch of his weathered cabin, a steaming cup of coffee warming his calloused hands as he watched the fog dance between the towering trees. At 62, his beard had turned the color of winter ash, and the lines around his eyes spoke of countless sunrises witnessed in solitude. But those same eyes held a clarity that comes only from a life lived honestly, far from the corruptions of civilized society. Beside him, Boone stretched and yawned, his golden retriever coat catching the amber light filtering through the canopy above. The dog had been Jed's constant companion for 8 years now, ever since he'd found the pup abandoned on the outskirts of Milbrook, the nearest town some 15 miles down the mountain trail. Boone possessed an intelligence that seemed almost human at times, as if he understood not just Jed's words, but the weight behind them. Another day in paradise. "Old friend," Jed murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. The ritual was as constant as the sunrise itself. Coffee, contemplation, and the quiet companionship of the one creature who'd never judged him for choosing this life. The cabin itself told the story of a man who'd built everything with his own hands. Solid timber walls chinked tight against the mountain winters, a stone chimney that drew smoke straight and true, and windows positioned to catch the morning light just so. Inside, the furnishings were sparse but well-crafted, a kitchen table worn smooth by years of use. Shelves lined with books whose pages had been turned countless times, and in the corner, an old trunk that held the few mementos of his former life. Most prominent among those mementos was his father's compass, its brass surface tarnished with age, but the needle still true. Samuel Carter had carried that compass through 3 wars, and when he'd passed it to his son, he'd said something Jed never forgot. "A man needs to know which direction he's heading, son. But more important, he needs to know why." Those words had echoed in Jed's mind 25 years ago, when he'd made the decision that changed everything. He'd been sheriff of Milbrook County then, a position of respect and authority that should have been the crown of a man's career. But respect and authority mean nothing when they're built on a foundation of lies. And Jed had discovered that the very men who'd put him in office were the ones poisoning the well of justice he'd sworn to protect. The memory still burned fresh in his mind. Mayor Harrison Pike, with his silver tongue and expensive suits, had pulled Jed aside one autumn evening and made what he called a reasonable proposition. Certain mining claims would be processed without the usual scrutiny. Certain land disputes would be resolved in favor of the right people. Certain arrests would be delayed or forgotten entirely. In return, Jed would find his salary doubled, his position secure, and his future bright. "Think about it, Carter," Pike had said, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "A man's got to look out for his own interests in this world. Nobody else will." But Jed had looked into his father's compass that night, and he'd known which direction he needed to head. The next morning he'd walked into the courthouse, laid his badge on Pike's desk, and spoken words that still rang with quiet dignity. "I reckon a man's integrity isn't something he can rent out by the month. Mayor, find yourself another sheriff." The retribution had been swift and merciless. Within a week, Jed found himself unemployed, unwelcome in the businesses he'd once protected, and branded as an ungrateful fool who'd bitten the hand that fed him. Old friends crossed the street to avoid him. The woman he'd been courting suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere when he came calling. Even the preacher seemed to have forgotten his name come Sunday morning. So Jed had taken what little he had and headed for the high country, where a man could live by his own code, and the only judgment that mattered came from his own conscience. He'd built this cabin with his own hands, learned to trap and hunt and fish for his sustenance, and discovered that a simple life honestly lived was worth more than all the comfortable compromises in the world. The years had been kind to him in their own way. His body remained strong from the daily labor of mountain living. His mind stayed sharp from the books he read by lamplight and the problems that required creative solutions. And his soul had found a peace that all the worldly success couldn't have purchased. But solitude, no matter how chosen, leaves its mark on a man. There were evenings when the silence felt too heavy, mornings when he wondered if anyone would notice, if he simply disappeared into the wilderness and never returned. It was on one such morning that Boone had appeared in his life, a golden-furred reminder that loyalty and love could exist without conditions or compromises. The townspeople of Milbrook had their own opinion of Jed Carter. To them, he was that crazy hermit up in the mountains, a cautionary tale about what happens to a man who can't adapt to the realities of civilized life. When they spoke of him at all, it was with a mixture of pity and dismissal. Poor old Jed, they'd say, couldn't handle being a real sheriff, so he ran off to play mountain man. They didn't know about the nights he'd lie awake listening to the wind through the pines, thinking about the town below and the corruption that had driven him away. They didn't know that he still read the Milbrook Gazette when he could get his hands on a copy, tracking the slow erosion of justice in the place he'd once called home. And they certainly didn't know that sometimes in his dreams he was still wearing that badge and fighting the fights that needed fighting. Mayor Pike had gone from strength to strength in the years since Jed's departure. What had started as small-scale corruption had grown into something far more significant. Pike's influence now extended throughout the territorial government. His mining interests had made him wealthy beyond his original dreams, and his network of allies and dependents had grown to include judges, territorial officials, and businessmen from 3 counties over. The morning routine continued as Jed finished his coffee and prepared for the day's work. There was wood to split, traps to check, and supplies to inventory. The approaching winter would be harsh. He could feel it in the way the wind carried itself, in the behavior of the wildlife, in the very bones of the mountains themselves. A wise man prepared early and prepared well. As he reached for his father's compass to check his bearings for the trapline, Jed paused. Something felt different about this particular morning, though he couldn't put his finger on what. Boone seemed to sense it too. His ears pricked forward with an alertness that suggested something beyond the usual mountain sounds. "What is it, boy?" Jed asked quietly. But the dog was already moving toward the tree line, his nose working the morning air. The feeling followed Jed as he went about his morning tasks. 25 years of mountain living had taught him to trust his instincts, and those instincts were telling him that change was coming. Not the gradual change of seasons or the slow evolution of a man's character, but something sudden and significant, the kind of change that divides a life into before and after. He'd learned to pay attention to such feelings. In his experience, the mountains had their own way of preparing a man for what lay ahead. They whispered warnings in the wind, sent messages through the behavior of animals, and sometimes they simply filled a man with the quiet certainty that his ordinary world was about to become extraordinary. As the sun climbed higher and the mist began to lift, Jed shouldered his pack and called to Boone. The trapline wouldn't check itself, and regardless of whatever changes might be coming, a man still had to tend to the practical business of survival. But as they headed into the deeper woods, Jed found himself thinking about his father's words one more time. A man needs to know which direction he's heading, and more important, he needs to know why. For 25 years, Jed had known his direction, away from the corruption and compromise of civilized life, toward the honest simplicity of the wilderness. Today, he wondered if that direction was about to change. The morning that would change everything started like countless others before it. Jed and Boone made their way along the familiar trapline, following paths worn smooth by decades of wildlife and the steady tread of the mountain man's boots. The air carried the crisp promise of autumn, and the aspens had begun their slow transformation from summer green to the gold that would soon paint the mountainsides. 3 miles from the cabin, Boone suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His ears swiveled forward, and a low whine escaped his throat. Not the excited sound he made when he caught scent of game, but something deeper, more uncertain. In all their years together, Jed had learned to read his companion's signals like words on a page. And this particular message was clear. Something was wrong. Easy. "Boy," Jed murmured, his own senses sharpening as he scanned the forest around them. The trap line led through a narrow valley where old-growth pines created a natural cathedral, their massive trunks rising like pillars toward a canopy so thick that noon felt like twilight. It was here, in this place where few men ever ventured, that Boone's nose led them off the familiar path. The dog moved with purpose now, his golden coat catching what little light filtered through the branches as he wove between fallen logs and granite outcroppings. Jed followed, his weathered hands instinctively checking the position of the knife at his belt and the rifle slung across his shoulder. 25 years of mountain living had taught him that the wilderness kept its own secrets, and not all of them were pleasant. What they found defied immediate explanation. Hidden in a natural depression between 2 massive boulders, partially concealed by decades of fallen branches and creeping moss, sat the remains of a stagecoach. But this wasn't some recent wreck. The wood had taken on the silver-grey patina of long exposure, and nature had begun its slow work of reclamation. Saplings grew through gaps in the floorboards, and what had once been leather seats were now home to generations of woodland creatures. Jed approached slowly, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. Stagecoaches hadn't run regular routes through this part of the territory for the better part of 30 years. The railroad had seen to that, carrying passengers and freight with a speed and efficiency that horse-drawn vehicles couldn't match. So what was this relic doing here, hidden in a place where no road had ever existed? The brass fittings, green with verdigris, still bore the faint outline of lettering. Jed brushed away years of accumulated grime and made out the words "Territorial Express" in ornate script. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He'd heard stories about a territorial express coach that had vanished without a trace nearly 20 years ago, carrying a strongbox bound for the territorial bank in Helena. The driver, the guard, and the passengers had simply disappeared, leaving behind nothing but questions and wild theories. Boone had moved to the far side of the wreckage, his paws scratching at something beneath the rotted floorboards. The sound was hollow, different from the solid thump of wood against stone. Jed knelt beside his companion and began clearing away the debris, his movements becoming more urgent as he realized what the dog had found. Hidden beneath a section of false flooring was a metal strongbox, its iron surface pitted with rust but still intact. The lock had long since corroded away, and when Jed lifted the lid, the hinges protested with a shriek that seemed to echo through the silent forest. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived the decades, were documents that would have been unremarkable to most men, but caused Jed's hands to tremble as he recognized their significance. Land deeds, mining claims, territorial appointment papers, all bearing official seals and signatures that lent them the weight of law. But as Jed read through the carefully preserved documents, a picture began to emerge that turned his stomach and made his pulse quicken with a mixture of rage and vindication. Here was proof of the corruption he'd suspected but never been able to document during his years as sheriff. Forged deeds that had transferred thousands of acres of prime mining land to Mayor Pike and his associates for pennies on the dollar. falsified territorial appointments that had placed Pike's allies in positions of power throughout the region. And most damning of all, a series of confessions and sworn statements from men who'd been part of the conspiracy but had apparently grown. Conscience-stricken as the scope of the fraud became clear, the statements told a story that reached back nearly 30 years, to the early days of Pike's rise to power. What had started as small-scale graft, a mining claim approved without proper survey, a land dispute decided in favor of the right pocketbook, had grown into something far more sophisticated and far-reaching. Pike and his inner circle had systematically looted the territorial government, using their positions to enrich themselves at the expense of honest settlers and legitimate businesses. One document in particular caught Jed's attention. It was a statement from Thomas Brennan, a territorial surveyor who'd apparently documented Pike's fraudulent land schemes. Brennan's words were careful and precise, detailing specific instances where surveys had been falsified, where boundaries had been moved to benefit Pike's interests, and where legitimate claims had been invalidated through bureaucratic sleight of hand. But the final paragraph of Brennan's statement sent ice through Jed's veins. "I fear for my safety and that of my family. Mayor Pike has made it clear that those who oppose him face more than financial ruin. The disappearance of Deputy Marshal Crawford after he began investigating the mining frauds is no coincidence. I am placing these documents in safekeeping and pray that someday they may serve the cause of justice." The date on Brennan's statement was just 3 weeks before the Territorial Express Stagecoach had vanished. Jed sat back on his heels, the full implications of his discovery washing over him like a cold mountain stream. The missing stagecoach hadn't been the victim of road agents or natural disaster. It had been carrying evidence that could have brought down Pike's entire operation. And somehow, that evidence had ended up here, hidden in a place where no one was ever meant to find it. But someone had found it. After 20 years of silence, the truth was finally free. As he carefully rewrapped the documents and placed them back in the strongbox, Jed's mind raced with possibilities and dangers. These papers could destroy Pike and his network of corruption, could finally bring justice to men who'd grown rich on the suffering of others. But they could also make Jed Carter the most hunted man in the territory. Pike had shown his willingness to kill to protect his secrets. Would he hesitate to eliminate a mountain hermit who threatened to expose everything? Boone whined softly and pressed against Jed's leg, as if sensing his master's inner turmoil. The dog's simple presence was a reminder of what mattered most. Not the grand gestures or the dramatic confrontations, but the quiet loyalty and honest purpose that had guided Jed's life for 25 years. He pulled out his father's compass and watched the needle settle on true north. The brass was warm from his pocket, and the familiar weight in his palm steadied his racing thoughts. "A man needs to know which direction he's heading," his father had said, "but more important, he needs to know why." For 25 years, Jed had been heading away from the corruption of Milbrook County. Now it seemed fate was asking him to turn around and face it head-on. The question wasn't whether he had the courage. The mountains had tested that repeatedly and found it sufficient. The question was whether he had the wisdom to know how to use what he'd found. As they made their way back toward the cabin, the strongbox secured in Jed's pack, the weight of it seemed to grow with every step. By the time they reached home, Jed Carter was carrying more than documents and evidence. He was carrying the hopes of every honest person who'd been cheated by Pike's machine, the dreams of every settler who'd lost their land to fraudulent claims, and the responsibility of a man who'd been given a second chance to make things right. The question now was what to do with that chance. The documents spread across Jed's kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle that had taken 20 years to assemble. By the light of 3 oil lamps, he worked through the night, organizing the evidence by date and subject, creating a timeline that revealed the full scope of Pike's criminal empire. Each page he examined added another layer to his understanding of just how deep the corruption ran and how dangerous his position had become. Boone lay beside the wood stove, But his usual peaceful sleep was interrupted by periods of alertness, as if the dog sensed his master's growing tension. Every so often, those golden eyes would fix on Jed with an intelligence that seemed almost human, and Jed found himself speaking aloud to his faithful companion, using the dog as a sounding board for thoughts too dangerous to voice to another human being. "Look at this, boy," Jed murmured, holding up a mining claim dated 15 years earlier. Pike claimed this section legally through the territorial office, but according to Brennan's survey notes, he moved the boundary markers 3 miles east after the paperwork was filed. That put the richest ore deposits on his land instead of the Henderson family's claim. The Henderson name brought back memories that made Jed's jaw tighten. He remembered Martha Henderson, a widow with 3 children who'd come to him as sheriff, desperate and confused about why her husband's carefully filed mining claim was suddenly worthless. The territorial office had told her there must have been an error in the original survey, that her late husband's claim had never included the profitable section of the mountain. Jed had suspected fraud then, but without proof, his hands had been tied. Now, 25 years later, he held the proof in his weathered fingers. But Martha Henderson was long dead, her children scattered to the wind, and the Henderson claim had made Pike wealthy, enough to buy judges and territorial appointments. Another document caught his attention, a letter from Pike to someone identified only as TR. The handwriting was Pike's distinctive scrawl, but the content was far from the polished political rhetoric he used in public. "The Crawford problem has been resolved permanently," Pike had written. "Our friends in Helena have been notified that the deputy marshal suffered an unfortunate accident while investigating mining disputes in the backcountry. His replacement will be more cooperative with territorial priorities." Jed's blood ran cold as he realized he was reading about a murder. Deputy Marshal Crawford. He remembered the man, a straight-talking lawman who'd earned respect throughout the territory for his integrity and thoroughness. Crawford's death in a supposed climbing accident had been the talk of the territory for weeks. But according to this letter, it had been cold-blooded murder, ordered by Pike to silence a federal investigation. The implications were staggering. If Pike was willing to kill a federal marshal, what would he do to a mountain hermit who threatened to expose 20 years of criminal activity? As dawn light began to creep through the cabin windows, Jed made his first crucial decision. He couldn't keep this evidence here. If Pike learned about the discovery, and men like Pike had ways of learning about threats to their empire, the cabin would become a death trap. The documents needed to be hidden somewhere safe, somewhere Pike's men would never think to look. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with. Throughout the morning he continued reading, and with each page the picture became clearer and more horrifying. Pike hadn't just stolen land and mining claims. He'd built a criminal organization that reached into every aspect of territorial government. Judges received monthly payments to ensure favorable rulings. Land office officials falsified records in exchange for shares in mining profits. Even some federal appointments had been influenced through Pike's network of corruption and intimidation. The most damning evidence came in the form of a ledger, its pages covered with careful notations in a hand Jed didn't recognize. The entries detailed 20 years of bribes, payoffs, and revenue sharing among Pike's criminal network. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars that should have gone to legitimate landowners. Territorial development and federal coffers had instead lined the pockets of corrupt officials. By midday, Jed had identified nearly 30 men whose careers and fortunes were built on Pike's criminal foundation. Some names he recognized from his days as sheriff, men he'd considered colleagues and friends. Others were territorial officials he'd only heard about in newspaper accounts. But all of them were implicated in a conspiracy that had robbed honest settlers and corrupted the very foundations of law and order in the territory. The weight of this knowledge pressed on Jed like a physical burden. For 25 years, he'd lived with the knowledge that his refusal to compromise had cost him his career and social standing. Now he discovered that his integrity had saved him from becoming part of a criminal conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of territorial government. The vindication was bitter, purchased with the suffering of people like Martha Henderson and the blood of men like Deputy Marshal Crawford. But vindication alone wasn't enough. Justice demanded action, and action carried risks that made Jed's hands tremble as he considered his options. The first option was the simplest: take the documents to federal authorities in Helena and let them handle the investigation and prosecutions. But Pike's influence extended into federal circles, and there was no guarantee that the evidence would reach honest officials before Pike learned of its existence. The fate of Deputy Marshal Crawford demonstrated what happened to federal agents who threatened Pike's interests. The second option was to take the evidence to newspapers, hoping that public exposure would force official action. But newspapers could be bought or intimidated, and Pike had demonstrated his willingness to use violence against threats to his empire. A mountain hermit with explosive documents would make an easy target for men willing to commit murder. The third option was to do nothing, return the strongbox to its hiding place, and let sleeping demons lie. 20 years of secrecy had preserved the evidence. Perhaps another 20 years would bring changes that made exposure safer. But this option felt like cowardice to a man who'd built his life on the principle that right and wrong weren't matters of convenience or timing. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Jed made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would act, but carefully and strategically. Pike's network had survived for 20 years because it operated in darkness, protected by secrecy and the isolation of its victims. The key to defeating such a network was exposure, not the sudden, dramatic revelation that could be suppressed or discredited, but the steady, methodical process of bringing truth into the light where it could take root and grow. That evening, as he carefully rewrapped the most critical documents for safekeeping, Jed found himself thinking about something his father had said during one of their hunting trips, years before the compass changed hands. "Son," the old man had observed, "there's a difference between bravery and foolishness. Brave men choose their battles carefully, fight them smart, and live to fight again. Fools charge ahead without thinking and usually get themselves and others killed." The documents would be hidden, but not forgotten. Copies would be made and distributed to multiple safe locations, and Jed Carter, the mountain hermit who'd been dismissed and forgotten by Milbrook County society, would begin the careful, dangerous work of bringing justice to men who thought themselves above the law. Outside, Boone's sudden bark interrupted his planning. The dog had heard something that set his protective instincts ablaze. Jed quickly extinguished 2 of the oil lamps and moved to the window, peering out at the surrounding forest. In the gathering twilight, he thought he saw movement among the trees, too purposeful to be wildlife, too careful to be coincidence. Someone was watching the cabin. The movement in the trees could have been shadows playing tricks in the dying light. But 25 years of mountain living had taught Jed to trust his instincts. When Boone's hackles rose and that low, warning growl rumbled in his throat, it meant danger was close. Jed quickly gathered the most critical documents from the table, stuffing them into a leather satchel that had served him well on countless hunting trips. Moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd learned to live as part of the wilderness rather than in opposition to it, Jed extinguished the remaining lamp and plunged the cabin into darkness. His eyes adjusted quickly, and he could make out Boone's silhouette near the door, every muscle tense with alertness. Through the window, the forest had returned to its natural stillness, but that only made Jed more suspicious. Whoever was out there knew how to move without disturbing the wildlife, a skill that suggested professional training rather than curious hunters or lost travelers. The back door of the cabin opened onto a small clearing, where Jed kept his woodpile and tool shed. Beyond that, the forest offered dozens of paths and hiding places that only someone intimate with the terrain could navigate in darkness. If men were coming for him, and the evidence suggested they were, his best chance lay in becoming invisible until he could determine their numbers and intentions. with hand signals he'd taught. Boone years earlier, Jed directed the dog to the rear door. They slipped out into the mountain night, and Jed secured the precious satchel across his chest before leading the way toward a granite outcropping that provided both concealment and a clear view of the cabin's front approach. The October air carried a bite that promised early snow, and Jed was grateful for the wool shirt that had served him through countless cold nights. They didn't have long to wait. Within minutes, dark figures emerged from the tree line, 3 men moving with the careful coordination of professionals. Even in the moonlight, Jed could see they carried rifles and moved like men accustomed to violence. These weren't local farmers or territorial deputies. These were the kind of men Pike would hire when discretion mattered less than results. The leader, a tall man with movements that suggested military training, approached the cabin's front door while his companions positioned themselves to cover the windows. When no response came to his firm knocking, the man stepped back and nodded to one of his partners. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the clearing as they forced their way inside. For several minutes, the sounds of systematic searching drifted from the cabin. Furniture scraped across floors, drawers were yanked open, and Jed could hear the methodical destruction of his simple home. When the men finally emerged, their leader's voice carried clearly in the mountain air. "Nothing here but an old hermit's belongings," he reported to someone unseen. "If Carter found anything, he's moved it already." The confirmation that they knew his name sent a chill through Jed that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Somehow, word of his discovery had reached Pike's organization with frightening speed. But how? The only living witnesses to the find were himself and Boone, and neither of them had spoken to another human being since yesterday morning. The answer came with the second man's voice, younger but equally professional. Pike's source in the Territorial Surveyor's office says the old Brennan files went missing 3 days ago. Someone's been asking questions about the missing stagecoach, and Carter's the only one who knows this mountain well enough to find it. Jed's mind raced as he processed this information. Someone inside the territorial government had been tracking the investigation into the missing stagecoach, which meant Pike had sources in places Jed hadn't even considered. The network of corruption was even more extensive than the documents had suggested, and that made his situation exponentially more dangerous. The third man spoke up, his voice carrying a casual brutality that made Boone press closer to Jed's side. "Should we wait for him to come back?" "Man's got to sleep somewhere." "Negative," the leader replied. "Pike wants this handled quietly, and a missing hermit draws less attention than a dead one found in his burned-out cabin. We'll track him down and make it look like an accident. Mountains full of places where an old man could fall and never be found." As the 3 men began examining the ground around the cabin for signs of Jed's departure, he made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. He couldn't run, not with what he knew, not with the evidence that could finally bring justice to Pike's victims. But he also couldn't fight 3 professional killers with nothing but a hunting rifle and 25 years of mountain craft. What he could do was disappear. The mountains had taught Jed patience, and patience now became his greatest weapon. As Pike's men established their search pattern, working outward from the cabin in methodical sweeps, Jed used every trick he'd learned in a quarter-century of wilderness living. He moved like smoke through terrain he knew better than his own reflection, always staying ahead of their search, but close enough to monitor their movements. By dawn, he'd learned several crucial things. The men were professionals, but they were city professionals, skilled at urban tracking and violence, but less comfortable in true wilderness. Their equipment was expensive, but not ideally suited for extended mountain operations. And most importantly, they were working to a timeline that suggested Pike wanted results quickly. That timeline became his opportunity. From a concealed position high on the ridge above his cabin, Jed watched Pike's men break camp and begin a more systematic search of the surrounding area. They moved with military precision, but they moved predictably, following established trails, checking obvious hiding places, operating according to training that assumed their quarry would behave like a frightened civilian. But Jed Carter wasn't a frightened civilian. He was a man who'd spent 25 years learning every secret the mountains had to teach. And those mountains were about to become his allies in a fight that would determine whether justice or corruption ruled Milbrook County. As the morning sun climbed higher, Jed began implementing a plan that would have seemed like madness to anyone who didn't know these mountains as intimately as he did. He would use Pike's hunters to send a message that would shake the corrupt network to its foundations. The documents in his satchel were just the beginning. The real weapon would be the knowledge that Jed Carter wasn't running scared. He was hunting back. The first part of his plan required reaching Sarah Mills, the widow who ran the trading post at Copper Creek, 15 miles down the mountain. Sarah had always been fair in her dealings with him, trading supplies for the furs and crafted goods he brought down from his mountain retreat. More importantly, she was one of the few people in the area who might help him without asking too many questions. But getting to Sarah's trading post would require crossing terrain that Pike's men would certainly be watching. The main trail was out of the question, and the back routes would take time he wasn't sure he had, as Boone pressed against his side, offering the comfort of unconditional loyalty. Jed pulled out his father's compass one more time. The needle pointed steadily north, toward town, toward danger, toward the confrontation he'd been avoiding for 25 years. Time to find out if the son was worthy of the father's legacy. The journey to Copper Creek required every skill Jed had acquired in his years of mountain living. Pike's men had established a patrol pattern that covered the main approaches to the trading post, forcing him to take a route that would have been impossible for anyone less familiar with the terrain. He moved through deadfall and granite maze, following game trails that existed more in the memory of wildlife than in any physical reality. Boone proved invaluable as they navigated the treacherous path. The dog's senses detected the hunters long before human ears could pick up their presence, giving Jed time to find concealment or alter his route. Twice they had to backtrack completely when Boone's warning signs indicated danger ahead. The 15-mile journey that normally would have taken 6 hours stretched into a full day of careful movement and patient waiting. Sarah Mills had built her trading post in a natural clearing beside Copper Creek, where the clear mountain water provided both a practical resource and a peaceful setting for commerce. The building itself was a testament to frontier practicality, solid log construction with a broad front porch where travelers could rest and locals could gather for conversation. Behind the main building, a smaller cabin served as Sarah's residence, connected to the store by a covered walkway that allowed her to move between business and home regardless of weather. At 68, Sarah possessed the kind of weathered strength that came from decades of frontier life. Her husband had died 10 years earlier, leaving her to run the trading post alone, and she'd done so with a combination of business acumen and no-nonsense determination that had earned respect throughout the region. She treated all customers fairly, extended credit when circumstances warranted it, and maintained a careful neutrality in local disputes that allowed her to serve everyone, from prosperous ranchers to struggling homesteaders. Jed had always appreciated Sarah's straightforward honesty. Unlike many of the townspeople who'd turned their backs on him after his conflict with Pike, Sarah had continued to welcome his business without judgment or curiosity about his reasons for choosing mountain isolation. Their trading relationship had evolved into something approaching friendship, built on mutual respect and the kind of trust that develops between people who keep their word. As twilight settled over the valley, Jed finally approached the trading post from the wooded ridge behind Sarah's cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light glowed in the windows, signs of normal evening routine that suggested Pike's men hadn't yet extended their search to this location. But Jed remained cautious, circling the buildings twice before he was satisfied that no watchers lurked in the surrounding forest. When he finally approached the back door of the cabin, his gentle knock was answered by Sarah's voice. sharp with the wariness that came from living alone in country where unexpected visitors often brought trouble. "Who's there?" "Jed Carter, Mrs. Mills. I need to speak with you about something important." The door opened to reveal Sarah's lined face, concern evident in her grey eyes as she took in Jed's obviously distressed condition. He'd been moving through rough country for hours. His clothes bore the marks of passage through thick undergrowth, and the tension in his posture spoke of a man carrying serious worries. "Jed, what brings you down from the mountain in such a state?" Come in, come in. You look like you could use coffee and a meal." The interior of Sarah's cabin reflected her practical nature. Comfortable furniture arranged for both functionality and warmth. Shelves lined with books and the small treasures that accumulate over a lifetime. And a kitchen that smelled of bread and wood smoke. Boone immediately settled by the fireplace, but his ears remained alert for sounds from outside. "I appreciate the hospitality, Sarah, but I'm afraid this isn't a social call. I've stumbled onto something that could put both of us in danger, and I need your help to make sure people learn about it." Sarah poured coffee from the pot that seemed to perpetually simmer on her stove and settled into the chair across from Jed's. Her expression had grown serious, but not fearful. This was a woman who'd faced frontier hardships and survived them through preparation and courage. "Tell me what's happened." Jed carefully explained his discovery of the stagecoach and the documents hidden within it, watching Sarah's face as the implications became clear. He'd brought 3 of the most damning pieces of evidence: Brennan's confession, Pike's letter about Crawford's murder, and a page from the ledger showing bribes paid to territorial officials. As Sarah examined each document, her expression grew darker. "Sweet mother of pearl," she whispered, holding up the letter about Crawford's death. "I remember when that deputy marshal died. Pike gave a speech at the memorial service, talked about the dangers good men face in service to justice, all the while knowing he'd ordered the man killed. That's just the beginning. Sarah, the documents I found prove that Pike's been stealing land, bribing officials, and murdering anyone who gets in his way for over 20 years. But he's got men looking for me now, and they're not interested in taking prisoners." Sarah set down the documents and fixed Jed with a steady stare that reminded him why he'd always respected her judgment. "What do you need from me?" "I need someone I can trust to get copies of these documents to people who can act on them. Federal marshals, territorial judges who aren't on Pike's payroll, maybe newspaper editors who have the courage to print the truth. But it has to be done carefully. Pike has sources everywhere, and anyone who threatens his operation ends up dead. And what will you be doing while I'm playing messenger?" Jed's expression hardened with a resolve that transformed his weathered features. "I'm going to make Pike understand that hunting Jed Carter was the biggest mistake he ever made. These mountains have been my home for 25 years, and they're about to become his nightmare." Sarah nodded slowly, recognizing something in Jed's tone that spoke of decisions made and lines crossed. "I can help with the documents, but you need to be smart about this, Jed. Pike didn't survive 20 years of corruption by being careless or merciful. The men he sent after you won't give up just because you make their job difficult." "I'm counting on that," Jed replied. And for the first time since discovering the stagecoach, he smiled, a cold expression that would have made Pike's hunters reconsider their assignment if they'd seen it. "See, they think they're hunting a frightened old hermit. What they don't realize is they're dealing with a man who spent 15 years as a peace officer before he came to these mountains. I know how criminals think, how they operate, and how they make mistakes." From her kitchen drawer, Sarah produced a leather portfolio and began carefully copying the most critical information from Jed's documents. Her handwriting was neat and clear, preserving every detail that might prove crucial in legal proceedings. As she worked, she spoke without looking up from her task. "There's something else you should know, Jed. Pike's not just worried about old crimes coming to light. Word around town is that he's got some big deal in the works. Something involving territorial officials from Helena and maybe federal contracts. If your documents threaten that deal, he'll be more desperate than usual. This information added another layer of urgency to Jed's situation. A desperate Pike would take greater risks and use more extreme measures to protect his interests. But it also suggested a timeline. Whatever Pike was planning, it was happening soon, which meant Jed's window for action was limited. As Sarah finished her copying work, she looked up at Jed with an expression that mixed concern and determination. "I'll get these to the right people, you have my word on that. But promise me you'll be careful out there. I've got few enough friends in this world. I'd hate to lose one to Harrison Pike's greed." "I'll be careful," Jed promised. Though they both understood that his definition of careful might differ significantly from hers. "And Sarah, if anyone comes asking questions about me, you've never seen these documents, and you don't know where I might be hiding." "What documents?" Sarah replied with a slight smile that reminded Jed why he'd trusted her with this dangerous knowledge. As he prepared to leave, Jed reached into his pack and withdrew something he'd carried for 25 years, but never thought he'd need again: his father's deputy marshal badge. Tarnished with age, but still bearing the authority of federal law enforcement. Sarah's eyes widened as she recognized what she was seeing. "My father carried this through 3 wars and 15 years of keeping peace on the frontier. When he passed it to me, I thought my law enforcement days were behind me. But maybe some badges choose their own time to be worn again." The return journey to the mountains took on a different character than Jed's careful approach to the trading post. No longer simply evading Pike's hunters, he was now actively seeking them out, using skills he'd thought buried with his law enforcement career. The badge in his shirt pocket seemed to pulse with familiar weight, reminding him of the man he'd been before retreat, and solitude had defined his existence. Boone sensed the change in his master immediately. Where before they'd moved like prey, avoiding predators, now they traveled with the purposeful intensity of hunters, tracking dangerous game. The dog's posture mirrored Jed's transformation, alert but confident, ready for whatever confrontation might come. As dawn broke over the high country, Jed positioned himself on a rocky outcropping that provided clear sightlines down 3 of the main approaches to his cabin. Pike's men had maintained their search pattern throughout the night, but their movements had grown less systematic as fatigue and frustration took their toll. Professional killers they might be, but they were operating in an environment that favored their quarry over their training. Through his father's old field, glasses, another relic of his law enforcement heritage, Jed studied the men who'd come to kill him. The leader was military trained. That much was clear from his bearing and the way he directed his companions. But his equipment choices suggested urban warfare experience rather than wilderness operations. The expensive tactical gear that served him well in city environments became a liability in terrain where silence and adaptation mattered more than firepower. The second man was younger, probably recruited from Pike's network of corrupt territorial officials. He had the soft look of someone accustomed to office work rather than physical confrontation, and his obvious discomfort with the mountain environment made him the weak link in their operation. When pressure mounted, he'd be the first to make mistakes. The third hunter intrigued Jed the most. Unlike his companions, this man moved through the wilderness with natural grace, reading the terrain and animal signs with skill that spoke of genuine frontier experience. But there was something cold about him, a casual indifference to violence that marked him as the most dangerous of the 3. This was the man Pike had sent to ensure the job was completed regardless of obstacles. As Jed watched their morning preparations, a plan began forming in his mind. These men expected to hunt a frightened hermit who would try to run and hide until they eventually cornered him. They weren't prepared for a quarry who understood their methods and could turn their own tactics against them. The mountains would become his allies, and their professional training would become their weakness. The first phase of his plan required separating the hunters from each other. United, they represented a formidable threat. Isolated and confused, they became manageable problems that could be dealt with individually. Jed knew these mountains well enough to predict their likely routes and camping spots, giving him the advantage of choosing when and where any confrontations would occur. He began with the simple expedient of making noise. Moving to a position half a mile from their current location, Jed used an old hunting trick his father had taught him, rolling a large stone down a rocky slope to create the sound of someone moving carelessly through the underbrush. The hunters responded immediately, the leader splitting his team to investigate from 2 directions while maintaining radio contact. But radio communication was limited in the high country, where granite ridges and deep valleys created dead zones that could swallow electronic signals. As the hunters moved into the canyon Jed had chosen for them, their voices began breaking up, forcing them to rely on visual contact across terrain where sightlines were measured in yards rather than miles. From his concealed position, Jed watched the youngest hunter work his way along the canyon floor while his companions took the high ground on either side. The man's inexperience showed in every step. He made too much noise, chose poor routes that left him exposed, and repeatedly looked back toward his companions instead of watching for threats ahead. When the moment came, Jed struck with the swift precision of a man who'd spent years bringing dangerous criminals to justice. A single stone, properly thrown, created enough noise to draw the young man's attention toward the wrong direction. By the time he realized his mistake, he was looking down the barrel of Jed's hunting rifle from a distance that made resistance futile. "Federal Deputy Marshal Carter," Jed announced, his voice carrying the authority he'd thought lost forever. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, trespassing, and attempted murder." The young man's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, fear, confusion, and finally a desperate bravado that didn't match his trembling hands. "You ain't no marshal, old man. You're just a crazy hermit living in the woods." Jed pulled his father's badge from his shirt pocket, letting the morning sun catch the tarnished metal. "This badge belonged to my father, who carried it through 3 wars and 15 years of frontier law enforcement. He passed it to me along with a commission that never expires. In the absence of regular territorial authority, a federal deputy marshal has jurisdiction over crimes against the United States." The legal technicality was questionable at best, but it carried enough weight of tradition and authority to give the young man pause. More importantly, it reminded Jed of who he'd been before Pike's corruption had driven him into exile. The badge didn't just represent his father's legacy, it embodied his own commitment to justice that 25 years of mountain solitude hadn't diminished. "Now," Jed continued, his voice taking on the patient tone he'd used with countless criminals during his sheriff days, "you're going to tell me everything about Pike's operation, how many men he's sent after me, what timeline he's working under, and what big deal Sarah mentioned that's got him so worried about old crimes coming to light." The interrogation that followed revealed information that both encouraged and alarmed Jed. Pike had committed only 3 men to the immediate task of eliminating the threat posed by the mountain hermit, suggesting he was trying to keep the operation quiet and contained. But the timeline was shorter than Jed had hoped. Pike needed the problem resolved within 48 hours, because territorial officials from Helena were arriving for a critical meeting that would finalize his latest scheme. The details of that scheme made Jed's blood run cold. Pike wasn't just stealing individual mining claims anymore. He was positioning himself to control the territory's mineral rights through a series of federal contracts that would give him legal authority over thousands of square miles of public land. The meeting in Helena would complete arrangements that had taken years to put in place and would make Pike wealthy beyond his previous dreams. But the scheme depended on Pike's reputation remaining intact long enough for the contracts to be signed. Any revelation of his criminal past would destroy not just his current plans, but his entire network of corruption. That made Jed Carter more than just an inconvenient witness. He was the single greatest threat to Pike's empire. As Jed secured his prisoner and prepared for the next phase of his plan, he realized that the stakes had risen far beyond personal vengeance or local justice. Pike's latest scheme would corrupt federal land policy and steal resources that belonged to all Americans. The documents hidden in the old stagecoach weren't just evidence of past crimes, they were the key to preventing future ones on an unprecedented scale. The key badge in his pocket seemed to grow heavier as the full weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders. He wasn't just Jed Carter, the mountain hermit, anymore. He was a federal officer with a duty that transcended personal safety or comfortable retirement. And somewhere in the mountains above, two professional killers were discovering that their easy assignment had become a very dangerous job. The captured hunter's information led Jed to a revelation that transformed everything he thought he understood about Pike's criminal empire. Hidden in a concealed pocket of the young man's jacket was a telegraph message that had been delivered just hours before the hunting party departed for the mountains. The message was brief, but its implications were staggering. Package secured. Brennan files confirmed destroyed. Proceed with elimination protocol. Meeting moved to Thursday. Federal signatures required by sunset. HP Jed read the message 3 times, each reading bringing new understanding of how completely he'd underestimated his adversary. Pike hadn't just learned about the missing stagecoach through government sources, he'd orchestrated its discovery. The package referenced in the telegram wasn't the documents Jed had found, but something else entirely. And the Brennan files that had supposedly gone missing from the Territorial Surveyor's office hadn't been stolen by random thieves. They'd been systematically destroyed by Pike's organization. But it was the final line that sent ice through Jed's veins. Federal signatures required by sunset meant that Pike's land grab scheme was happening today, not in 48 hours, as the captured hunter had claimed. Either the young man had been given false information to protect the operation's timeline, or he'd deliberately lied to buy his associates more time. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted Jed's analysis of this new intelligence. Through the canyon walls, he could hear at least 6 horses moving at a fast clip toward his position. Pike hadn't sent just 3 men to eliminate the threat. He'd sent them as scouts for a larger force that was now converging on the mountains with deadly efficiency. Using hand signals, Jed directed Boone to a concealed position among the granite boulders while he secured their prisoner and prepared for what promised to be a running battle through terrain he knew intimately but couldn't control indefinitely. The captured hunter's smug expression suggested he'd been expecting this reinforcement all along. "Told you this was bigger than you could handle, old man," the young man taunted. "Pike's got 20 men riding up here, and they ain't planning to take prisoners this time." 20 men. Even with every advantage the mountains could provide, those odds were impossible for a single man to overcome through conventional tactics. But as Jed checked his rifle and counted his ammunition, he remembered something his father had taught him during their hunting expeditions. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to make sure it happens on different terms than your enemy expects. The riders were closer now, their voices echoing off the canyon walls as they coordinated their approach. From the sound, they were splitting into multiple groups to surround the area where Jed's earlier confrontation had taken place. Professional tactics, executed by men who understood mountain warfare far better than the original 3 hunters had demonstrated. But as Jed prepared to begin a fighting retreat toward higher ground, Boone's behavior caught his attention. Instead of showing the alertness that usually preceded danger, the dog was exhibiting the confused wariness he displayed when familiar scents appeared in unexpected places. Following Boone's gaze toward the approaching riders, Jed raised his field glasses and focused on the lead horseman. What he saw challenged everything he thought he knew about his situation. The rider wore the uniform of a territorial deputy marshal, his badge clearly visible even at distance. Behind him rode men in similar uniforms, their bearing and equipment suggesting legitimate law enforcement rather than Pike's hired killers. But if these were genuine federal officers, what were they doing here? And how had they learned about the situation so quickly? The answer came from an unexpected source. Sarah Mills emerged from behind a screen of aspen trees, riding her sturdy mare and waving a white handkerchief to signal peaceful intentions. Beside her rode a man whose weathered features and steady bearing immediately marked him as a veteran peace officer. "Jed Carter," Sarah called out as the group approached his position. "I want you to meet Deputy Marshal Frank Morrison from the Helena office. Seems your discovery has stirred up more interest than either of us expected." Morrison dismounted and approached with the careful respect of one lawman meeting another in uncertain circumstances. His handshake was firm, his eyes direct, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with complex situations. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Mills has shown me copies of the documents you found, and I have to tell you, they've answered questions we've been asking for years. What you don't know is that you're not the only one who's been investigating Harrison Pike's organization. The revelation that federal authorities had been conducting their own investigation of Pike's activities should have been encouraging. But something in Morrison's manner suggested complications that went beyond simple law enforcement coordination. For the past 18 months, Morrison continued, we've been building a case against Pike and his associates. We knew about the land fraud, suspected the bribery, and had theories about the missing stagecoach. What we didn't have was proof that would stand up in federal court. Morrison gestured toward the documents Jed still carried. Those papers you found represent years of investigative work that we thought was lost forever. But they also represent a problem we didn't anticipate. The problem, as Morrison explained it, was one of timing and jurisdiction that threatened to destroy both investigations. Pike's federal land scheme was indeed moving forward today, but it was being finalized in Helena under the supervision of territorial officials who were either corrupt or unaware of Pike's criminal background. The documents from the stagecoach could stop the scheme, but only if they reached Helena before the contracts were signed. "Here's where it gets complicated," Morrison said, his expression growing grim. "Pike knows about our investigation, has known for months, probably through sources in the territorial government. What he doesn't know is how much evidence we've actually gathered, or that you've found the Brennan documents." The captured hunter's telegraph message suddenly made sense. Pike had ordered the elimination of Jed Carter not just to silence a witness, but to retrieve documents that he believed were the only remaining evidence of his crimes. The federal investigation had been compromised, possibly from its inception, and Pike was moving to eliminate the last threat to his plans. But Morrison's next revelation turned Jed's understanding of the situation completely upside down. "The thing is, Mr. Carter, Harrison Pike isn't the head of this organization. He's a middle manager in a corruption network that reaches all the way to Washington. The land scheme you've uncovered is just one part of a systematic looting of territorial resources that involves senators, federal judges, and cabinet officials." Morrison pulled a worn photograph from his jacket and showed it to Jed. The image showed Pike standing with several men in expensive suits, their poses suggesting the easy familiarity of long association. But it was the figure at the center of the group that made Jed's hands tremble with recognition and rage. Thomas Brennan, the territorial surveyor whose confession had provided the most damning evidence against Pike, was very much alive and apparently prosperous. The man whose supposed murder had driven the documents into hiding was not only breathing, but wearing clothes that suggested wealth far beyond a government employee's salary. Brennan faked his own death, Morrison explained, watching Jed's face as the implications became clear. He's been living under an assumed name in San Francisco, managing the financial side of the corruption network, while Pike handled territorial operations. The confession you found was genuine. It documented real crimes and real fears. But Brennan wrote it as insurance, not as a final testament. The betrayal was complete and devastating. The man whose courage Jed had admired, whose apparent sacrifice had inspired his own decision to seek justice, had been a criminal mastermind playing an elaborate game of misdirection. The documents that seemed to provide the key to Pike's downfall were actually part of a carefully constructed cover story designed to protect the real leaders of the conspiracy. So where does that leave us? Jed asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Morrison's smile was grim but determined. It leaves us with a choice, Mr. Carter. We can let this corruption network continue operating while we build a new case that might take years to complete. Or we can use what we know right now to stop the land scheme and force their hand. The second option is dangerous for everyone involved, but it's the only chance we have to prevent them from stealing millions of acres of federal land. As if to emphasize the urgency of their situation, one of Morrison's deputies approached with a telegraph message that had just arrived from Helena. The federal contracts were being prepared for signature within hours, not days. If Pike's scheme wasn't stopped immediately, it would become legally unstoppable. Jed looked at the badge in his palm, then at the men who were asking him to risk everything for a cause that had just become far more complex and dangerous than he'd ever imagined. But the choice, when it came down to it, wasn't really a choice at all. What do you need me to do? The plan that emerged from Morrison's tactical briefing was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. With less than 6 hours before Pike's federal contracts would be signed in Helena, there was no time for careful investigation or methodical legal procedures. They would have to intercept Pike's operation at its most vulnerable point, the moment when he transported the forged documents and bribes necessary to complete his scheme. According to Morrison's intelligence, Pike would be traveling to Helena by private coach, accompanied by a small security detail and carrying a strongbox containing the financial instruments needed to secure federal cooperation. The route between Milbrook and the territorial capital passed through Devil's Canyon, a narrow passage between granite cliffs where a small force could stop a much larger one. It's not ideal, Morrison admitted, as he spread a hand-drawn map across a flat boulder. We'll be operating outside normal legal procedures, and if this goes wrong, every one of us will face federal charges for interfering with territorial business. But it's the only chance we have to stop this land grab before it becomes irreversible. Jed studied the map, his trained eye noting the tactical advantages and dangers of the proposed ambush site. Devil's Canyon had been carved by centuries of spring runoff, creating walls too steep for horses to climb and a floor barely wide enough for a single coach. Once Pike's party entered the canyon, retreat would be impossible, but the confined space would also make any firefight extremely dangerous for both sides. What about innocent people? Jed asked, remembering his oath as a peace officer to protect civilians even in the pursuit of criminals. Pike's not traveling alone, and some of his companions might not know they're part of a criminal conspiracy. Morrison's expression grew heavy with the weight of command decisions that had no perfect answers. We'll give everyone a chance to surrender peacefully, but if Pike's people choose to fight, we'll have to be ready to finish what they start. The alternative is letting them steal millions of acres of federal land and continue corrupting territorial government for years to come. The moral complexity of their situation weighed on Jed as he considered the transformation his life had undergone in just 3 days. He'd gone from peaceful mountain hermit to federal officer, preparing for armed confrontation with criminals who commanded significant resources and political influence. The badge in his pocket felt heavier with each passing hour, carrying not just his father's legacy, but the responsibility of preventing a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of government. Sarah Mills had insisted on remaining with the group, despite Morrison's protests about civilian safety. Her knowledge of local terrain and Pike's habits had already proved valuable, and she showed no inclination to retreat to safety while others risked their lives for justice. I've been watching Pike destroy this county for 20 years, she told Morrison when he suggested she return to her trading post. If there's a chance to stop him, I'm not walking away just because it might be dangerous." As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western peaks, the federal officers made their final preparations for what promised to be the most significant law enforcement operation in the territory's history. Morrison's deputies checked their weapons and equipment with the methodical care of men who understood that mistakes in the coming confrontation would likely prove fatal. Jed found himself thinking about the years he'd spent in peaceful isolation, tending his trap lines and reading by lamplight while corruption flourished in the world below. The solitude had given him perspective and inner peace, but it had also allowed evil to grow unchecked while good men stood aside. Perhaps his father's badge had been waiting all these years for this moment, when a man's individual choice to act or retreat would determine the fate of thousands of innocent people. The captured hunter had provided crucial intelligence about Pike's security arrangements. Though Morrison remained suspicious about information obtained from an enemy who had every reason to lie, Pike would be accompanied by 8 armed guards, all of them professionals hired from outside the territory to ensure they had no local loyalties that might compromise their effectiveness. The guards knew nothing about the broader conspiracy. They'd been told they were protecting a territorial official conducting sensitive government business. This ignorance could work in the federal officers' favor, since men fighting for wages were less likely to sacrifice their lives than true believers defending a cause. But it also meant that Pike's guards would be operating under rules of engagement that assumed they were legitimate security personnel dealing with criminal attacks rather than corrupt employees protecting an illegal operation. Moral ambiguity troubled Jed more than the physical danger. As a peace officer, he'd always operated under clear legal authority with well-defined rules about the use of force. This operation existed in a gray area where federal deputies were acting without explicit authorization to intercept territorial officials based on evidence that hadn't been tested in court. But Morrison's final briefing put their actions in perspective that transcended legal technicalities. The federal investigation had uncovered evidence that Pike's corruption network was planning similar land grabs in 3 other territories, using the Montana scheme as a template for systematic theft of natural resources across the American West. If they succeeded here, the precedent would encourage similar operations throughout the frontier, transforming territorial development from a process of legitimate settlement into a massive criminal enterprise. "We're not just stopping Harrison Pike," Morrison told his assembled team as they prepared to move toward Devil's Canyon. "We're preventing a form of corruption that could destroy the entire territorial system and deny statehood to regions that deserve honest government." The ride to Devil's Canyon took them through country Jed had known intimately for 25 years, but seeing it through the eyes of a law enforcement operation gave the familiar landscape new significance. Every ridge and valley became a tactical consideration, every stand of timber a potential source of cover or concealment. The mountains that had been his refuge were about to become a battleground where the future of territorial government would be decided. As they approached the ambush site, Morrison split his force into 3 groups, positioned to control all possible escape routes from the canyon. Jed found himself assigned to the primary blocking position, where his knowledge of the terrain and his proven ability to make difficult decisions under pressure would be most valuable. Boone remained at his side, the dog's presence a reminder of the simple loyalties and honest relationships that made their dangerous work meaningful. The waiting was the hardest part. Hidden among the rocks and scrub pine that lined the canyon rim, Jed had time to think about all the ways their plan could go wrong. Pike might have changed his route. The security detail might be larger than expected. Federal authorities in Helena might be so thoroughly corrupted that stopping the contract signing would accomplish nothing, but doubt was a luxury they couldn't afford. Through his field glasses, Jed could see dust clouds on the distant road that suggested approaching vehicles. Pike was coming, and within the next hour, 2 decades of territorial corruption would either end in Devil's Canyon or continue unchallenged for years to come. The photograph Morrison had shown him remained tucked inside Jed's shirt pocket, next to his father's badge. The image of Pike with Brennan and the other conspiracy leaders served as a reminder that their confrontation was about more than local corruption or personal justice. It represented a battle between the forces of honest government and systematic criminal enterprise, between the rule of law and the power of money to corrupt even the most sacred institutions. As the sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls, Jed checked his rifle one final time and offered a silent prayer for wisdom and courage. His father's compass pointed steadily north, toward Helena and the federal offices where Pike's contracts waited for signatures. But the moral compass that had guided Jed's life pointed toward duty, regardless of personal cost. In the distance, he could see Pike's coach beginning its descent into Devil's Canyon, carrying the man whose corruption had driven Jed into 25 years of exile. The badge in his pocket seemed to pulse with the weight of approaching confrontation, reminding him that some fights choose their own time and place. The time had come to discover whether a mountain hermit and a small band of federal officers could stand against a corruption network that reached from Montana to Washington. The outcome would determine not just Pike's fate, but the future of honest government in the American West. Boone pressed against Jed's leg, offering the comfort of unconditional loyalty, as the final act of their long journey toward justice began to unfold in the narrow confines of Devil's Canyon. Pike's coach entered Devil's Canyon at precisely 3:30 in the afternoon, the sound of iron-shod wheels on stone echoing between the granite walls like gunshots. From his concealed position on the canyon rim, Jed watched the procession with the focused intensity of a man whose entire life had led to this moment. The coach was larger than he'd expected, a heavy freight wagon built for carrying valuable cargo rather than the elegant passenger vehicle he'd anticipated. 8 mounted guards flanked the wagon in a formation that spoke of professional training and serious purpose. Their leader, a tall man with military bearing, rode ahead of the main group, his eyes constantly scanning the canyon walls for signs of ambush. These weren't local thugs hired for intimidation. They were experienced fighting men who understood their business and took it seriously. Harrison Pike himself was visible through the coach's window, his silver hair catching the afternoon light as he leaned forward to speak with someone inside the vehicle. Even at distance, his posture conveyed the confidence of a man who'd spent 20 years building an empire through corruption and intimidation. He showed no sign of concern about the isolated canyon passage, suggesting either supreme confidence in his security arrangements or complete ignorance of the forces arrayed against him. Morrison's voice carried clearly from his position across the canyon, amplified by the natural acoustics of the narrow passage. Harrison Pike, by order of the Federal Territorial Authority, you are commanded to halt your vehicle and submit to lawful inspection. The response was immediate and decisive. Pike's security chief raised his hand in a signal that sent his men into defensive positions, their rifles appearing with practiced efficiency. The coach driver lashed his horses forward, attempting to race through the canyon before the federal officers could establish an effective blockade. But Morrison had anticipated this response. A heavy log, positioned earlier by his deputies, rolled across the canyon floor to block the narrow passage ahead of the speeding coach. The driver hauled desperately on his reins, bringing his horses to a sliding stop just short of collision with the improvised barrier. "Federal officers," Morrison called again, his badge visible as he stood from concealment. "Throw down your weapons and surrender peacefully. You're suspected of involvement in criminal conspiracy against the territorial government." What followed was a moment of tense silence that stretched like a held breath across the canyon floor. Pike's guards looked to their leader for instructions, their horses shifting nervously beneath them as the animals sensed the approaching violence their masters were contemplating. The security chief's decision came in. the form of a rifle shot that sent rock chips flying from the boulder behind which Morrison had taken cover. Within seconds, the canyon erupted in gunfire as Pike's guards and the federal officers engaged in a deadly crossfire that filled the narrow space with smoke and the sharp crack of rifles echoing off stone walls. From his elevated position, Jed had a clear view of the entire engagement, but the angle made it difficult to provide effective fire support without risking hits on the federal officers below. He could see Morrison's men taking cover behind the natural rock formations that dotted the canyon floor, their return fire disciplined and accurate despite the disadvantage of being caught in an enclosed space. Pike's coach had become a fortress at the center of the firefight, with the strong box-laden vehicle providing cover for several guards, while the driver struggled to control horses maddened by the sound of gunfire. Through the chaos, Jed could see Pike himself crouched inside the coach, no longer the confident power broker, but a frightened man caught in the consequences of his criminal choices. The federal officer's tactical advantage began to show as the engagement continued. Morrison had positioned his men to create overlapping fields of fire that made movement dangerous for Pike's guards, while providing mutual support for the government forces. Two of the security men were already down, their horses running riderless toward the canyon mouth, but Pike's remaining guards were fighting with the desperate intensity of men who understood that surrender meant prison or worse. Their leader had taken position behind the coach itself, using the heavy vehicle as mobile cover while he directed his remaining men in a coordinated defense that was gradually being overwhelmed by superior positioning and numbers. The turning point came when Sarah Mills, operating according to a plan Jed hadn't been told about, appeared at the canyon's far end with 3 additional deputies who'd been held in reserve. Caught between two forces and running low on ammunition, Pike's security chief made the pragmatic decision of a professional soldier facing impossible odds. "Cease fire," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon. "We surrender. Hold your fire." The sudden silence that followed was almost as dramatic as the gunfire had been. Smoke drifted through the canyon like morning mist, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with dust and fear filled the mountain air. Several horses stood riderless, their reins dragging as they searched for familiar human voices among the aftermath of violence. Morrison emerged from cover with his badge held high, approaching the coach with the careful steps of a man who'd seen too many surrenders turn into desperate last stands. Behind him, federal deputies maintained covering positions while keeping their weapons ready for resumed fighting. "Harrison Pike," Morrison called out as he reached the coach door. "You are under arrest for conspiracy against the United States, fraud, bribery, and accessory to murder. Step out of the vehicle with your hands visible." Pike's emergence from the coach was a study in the collapse of arrogance under the weight of consequence. The man who had commanded respect and fear throughout the territory for 2 decades stepped onto the canyon floor with trembling hands and the pale complexion of someone whose world had just crumbled around him. Gone was the silver-tongued politician who could charm territorial officials and intimidate honest citizens. In his place stood a frightened criminal facing the justice he'd spent years avoiding. But even in defeat, Pike retained the cunning that had built his criminal empire. As Morrison approached with federal handcuffs, Pike's eyes darted toward the strongbox secured in the back of his coach, a look that didn't escape Jed's attention from his elevated position. "You're making a terrible mistake." "Marshal," Pike said, his voice struggling to regain its old authority, "I'm conducting legitimate territorial business under the direct authorization of federal officials in Washington. When they learn about this interference, your career will be finished." Morrison's smile was grim but satisfied. "The federal officials you're referring to are currently being arrested by my colleagues in Washington. Mr. Pike, your corruption network has been under investigation for 18 months. And this operation represents the coordinated takedown of the entire conspiracy." The color drained from Pike's face as he realized the full scope of the trap that had closed around him. But his eyes remained fixed on the strongbox, and Jed began to understand that Pike's concern wasn't just about the money and documents it contained. There was something else in that box, something that Pike considered more dangerous to his enemies than to himself. The revelation came when Morrison opened the strongbox and began examining its contents. Along with the expected bundles of cash and forged territorial documents, he found a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be a complete record of every transaction, bribe and criminal act committed by Pike's organization over the past 20 years. But these weren't just Pike's records. They were insurance policies documenting the involvement of federal officials, territorial judges, and business leaders throughout the American West. Interesting reading material. "Mr. Pike," Morrison observed, leafing through the portfolio, "it seems you kept very detailed records of your associates' activities, almost as if you were preparing for a situation exactly like this one." Pike's laugh held no humor, only the bitter satisfaction of a man playing his final card. "You think arresting me solves your problem, Marshal? Those records document criminal activities by 3 senators, a federal judge, 4 territorial governors, and business leaders in 7 states. If anything happens to me, copies of those documents will be delivered to every newspaper west of the Mississippi." The implications of Pike's threat transformed the nature of their victory. They'd succeeded in stopping the immediate land grab and capturing the territorial leader of the corruption network. But Pike held evidence that could destroy the careers and reputations of dozens of powerful men who might or might not have been willing participants in his schemes. Morrison's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the political ramifications of Pike's revelation. A man facing life in prison had nothing to lose by exposing everyone who'd ever dealt with his organization, regardless of their level of complicity or awareness. The resulting scandal could undermine public confidence in territorial government and delay statehood for regions that deserved legitimate representation. It was then that Jed made a decision that surprised everyone present, including himself. Climbing down from his elevated position, he approached Morrison and Pike with the measured steps of a man who'd found unexpected clarity in the midst of chaos. "There's another way to handle this," Jed said, pulling the photograph Morrison had shown him from his shirt pocket. "This picture shows Pike with Thomas Brennan and the other conspiracy leaders. But it also shows something else that might interest you, Mr. Pike." Pike's eyes widened as he recognized the photograph, but his expression shifted from fear to confusion as he studied the image more carefully. In the background, barely visible but unmistakably present, stood a figure Pike had never noticed during the original meeting, a federal agent whose presence at the gathering indicated that the government's investigation had begun far earlier than anyone had realized. "Deputy Marshal Crawford," Jed continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man delivering judgment. "The man you had killed because he was getting too close to your operation. Except he didn't die in that climbing accident, did he? He went underground, became part of the federal investigation, and has been documenting your activities from the inside for 3 years." Morrison's smile confirmed Jed's deduction. "Thomas Crawford is very much alive, Mr. Pike, and his testimony, combined with the evidence you've so thoughtfully preserved in your strongbox, will be more than sufficient to convict you and your associates without needing to expose every peripheral figure who may have unknowingly dealt with your organization." The fight went out of Pike completely. His insurance policy had become worthless the moment he learned that his greatest victory, the murder of a federal officer, had actually been his greatest defeat. Crawford's survival meant that the government had testimony from someone who'd witnessed Pike's crimes firsthand and could authenticate the documentary evidence without relying on the explosive revelations Pike had hoped to use as leverage. As Morrison secured Pike in federal custody and began the process of cataloging the evidence that would destroy the corruption network, Jed found himself thinking about the strange path that had led him to this moment. 3 days ago, he'd been a forgotten hermit living in peaceful isolation. Now he stood in a canyon filled with the aftermath of gunfire, having played a crucial role in the most significant law enforcement operation in territorial history. The badge in his pocket seemed lighter now, as if the weight of unfulfilled duty had finally been lifted from his shoulders. His father's compass pointed north toward Helena, where federal officers would soon be presenting evidence that would clean up territorial government and restore honest administration to the region. But for the first time in 25 years, Jed Carter wasn't sure which direction his own path would lead him next. 6 months later, Jed Carter stood once again on the porch of his mountain cabin, but the world around him had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The morning mist still clung to the pine needles, and Boone still stretched beside him as the first light crept through the forest canopy. But the weight that had pressed on his shoulders for 25 years, the burden of unfinished business and justice delayed, had finally lifted. The trials that followed Pike's arrest had become the most significant legal proceedings in territorial history. The evidence from the hidden stagecoach, combined with Deputy Marshal Crawford's undercover testimony and Pike's own meticulously kept records, had resulted in convictions that reached from Montana to Washington, D.C. Pike himself was serving a life sentence in federal prison. His empire of corruption dismantled piece by piece through methodical prosecution. Sarah Mills had become something of a local celebrity, her trading post now a regular stop for newspaper reporters and federal investigators, documenting the cleanup of territorial government. She'd used her newfound prominence to advocate for honest business practices and transparent government, becoming an unofficial spokesperson for the many citizens who'd suffered under Pike's regime. "You've got visitors coming up the trail," Sarah called out as she emerged from the tree line, leading 2 horses and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd played a crucial role in restoring justice to her community. Behind her rode Deputy Marshal Morrison, his badge catching the morning light as he approached the cabin, with the easy manner of a friend rather than an official. "Morning, Jed," Morrison said as he dismounted. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I've got some news I thought you'd want to hear in person rather than read in the Territorial Gazette." The news was better than Jed had dared hope. The federal land scheme Pike had been orchestrating was not only stopped, but reversed, with thousands of acres of fraudulently claimed territory returned to legitimate owners or designated as public land for future settlement. The Martha Henderson claim that had haunted Jed's memory for 25 years was among the properties restored to its rightful owners, Henderson's surviving. Children would finally receive the inheritance their father had intended them to have. "There's something else," Morrison continued, his expression growing more serious. "The Attorney General's office in Washington has been reviewing the territorial situation, and they've concluded that Montana needs federal oversight during the transition to honest government. They're looking for someone with law enforcement experience who knows the territory and can't be bought or intimidated." The offer was both honor and burden, a chance to help rebuild the system Pike had corrupted, but also a return to the public life Jed had fled decades earlier. The position would carry significant authority and the backing of federal resources, but it would also make him a target for the remnants of Pike's organization and other corrupt interests that survived throughout the territory. Jed's hand moved instinctively to the compass in his pocket, the familiar weight offering comfort as he considered Morrison's proposition. His father's words echoed in his memory. A man needs to know which direction he's heading. But more important, he needs to know why. For 25 years, his direction had been away from the corruption and compromise of civilized society, toward the honest simplicity of mountain life. That choice had given him peace and perspective, but it had also allowed evil to flourish while good men stood aside. The discovery of the hidden stagecoach had forced him to confront the consequences of his withdrawal from the world, and the events that followed had reminded him that sometimes a man's greatest duty lies not in protecting his own peace, but in fighting for justice regardless of personal cost. "I'll need some time to think about it," Jed replied. though part of him already knew what his answer would be. The badge in his other pocket, his father's deputy marshal commission that had never officially expired, seemed to pulse with expectation. After Morrison and Sarah departed, promising to return in a few days for his final answer, Jed found himself walking the familiar paths around his cabin with Boone at his side. The mountains that had been his refuge would always be part of him, but he was no longer the same man who'd fled to them in anger and disappointment. The events of recent months had transformed him from a bitter exile into someone who understood that true peace could only be found through the proper exercise of justice. That evening, as he sat by the fire, reading one of the books that had sustained him through years of solitude, Jed came across a passage that seemed to speak directly to his situation. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. The words carried new weight now, informed by his recent experiences and the knowledge that his personal choices had consequences far beyond his mountain retreat. The decision, when it finally crystallized in his mind, felt as natural as sunrise. He would accept Morrison's offer, not because he craved power or recognition, but because the mountains had taught him that a man's strength was meaningless unless it served a purpose larger than himself. The corruption that had driven him into exile was defeated, but the work of building honest government would require the same patience, determination, and moral courage that had sustained him through 25 years of mountain living. As he prepared for bed, Jed carefully placed his father's compass and badge on the table beside his bed, where they would be ready for the journey ahead. Tomorrow, he would begin preparing for his return to public life. But tonight, he allowed himself to appreciate the simple pleasure of a decision well made and a duty finally understood. Outside, the mountain wind carried the scent of pine and the promise of changing seasons. Change was coming to Montana Territory, and for the first time in decades, it would be change guided by justice rather than greed. Jed Carter, the mountain hermit who'd found the courage to become a lawman again, would help ensure that the transformation served the honest, people who deserved better from their government. Boone settled beside the fireplace with the contented sigh of a dog whose master had found his proper path. In the morning, they would begin the journey down from the mountains, carrying the lessons of solitude back to the world that needed them most.